Brown, and Zimmerman were volatile and often escalated to violence. Brown had previously accused Zimmerman of slashing her tires. Zimmerman had accused Brown of shattering a window in her car, having her boyfriend arrested, and reporting to the Florida Department of Children and Families that she was providing inadequate care to her children. Lee testified that she had intervened on multiple occasions to stop physical altercations between Miller and Zimmerman. In fact, on one occasion, Miller, who had recently discovered that Zimmerman was sexually involved with her boyfriend, attempted to strike Zimmerman. Zimmerman, however, defended herself by attempting to disable Miller with a stun gun. So later that day, Lee informed Brown that Zimmerman had used a stun gun on Brown's daughter, to which Brown responded that she was going to get Zimmerman.
In a small Florida town where everyone knew everyone, life moved slow and familiar. Porch lights glowed, neighbors waved, and secrets whispered between trailers. 16-year-old Brittany Miller grew up there, quiet, shy, raised by a mother who ruled more than she loved. Just a few doors down lived 19-year-old Audriana Zimmerman, warm-hearted, outspoken, the kind of girl who made everyone feel seen. But in places like Ensley, friendship could turn fragile, and small resentments could grow teeth. In the days before March 24, 2010, something was shifting. A rumor, a spark, a choice that couldn't be undone. That night, innocence vanished, and two young lives took a path no one could imagine. In a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, no one saw what was coming next. But that wasn't the last time Audriana's name would be heard that night. March 24, 2010, began like any other humid evening in Ensley. The streetlights blinked to life one by one, kids ran home for dinner, and the faint sound of a television leaked from open trailer windows. 19-year-old Audriana Zimmerman picked up her phone and saw a message from someone she thought she knew well, Tina Brown. Tina's text was short, friendly, and ordinary. "Come by for a minute," it read. Audriana hesitated, but agreed. She'd known Tina's daughter, Brittany, for years. They'd shared laughs, hung out after school, and sometimes confided in each other. It wasn't strange to stop by. What she didn't know was that inside that trailer, a trap was already waiting. As she walked across the gravel drive toward the small, single-wide home, the evening air grew heavy. She knocked once and heard voices inside, laughter, faint and unsteady. Tina called out, "Doors open!" The moment Audriana stepped in, the mood shifted. The laughter stopped. The door clicked shut. In that second, everything familiar turned cold. What happened next would later be described in testimony so chilling, officers in the courtroom refused to look at the photos again. Inside the trailer, Tina Brown's voice cut through the silence. "You thought you could talk about me?" she said sharply. Audriana stammered, "I didn't say anything, Tina, I swear." Heather Lee stood near the doorway, arms folded, avoiding eye contact. On the couch, 16-year-old Brittany Miller looked frozen, nervous, confused, but silent. Investigators later testified that what began as confrontation turned violent in seconds. Tina grabbed a crowbar from behind the couch and swung. The first blow landed across Audriana's shoulder. A scream filled the small room. Heather flinched, but Tina's voice grew louder. "Hold her down!" she yelled. Audriana begged, "Please stop! I didn't do anything!" But there was no mercy. A stun gun cracked, filling the air with its sharp buzz. Brittany hesitated, trembling, her eyes darting between her mother and the girl on the floor. "Mama, stop!" she whispered, but Tina snapped back, "Do what I told you." Under pressure and fear, Brittany obeyed. Detective Lisa Ward later told reporters, "You could see from the evidence that the girl tried to shield herself. She fought for her life." Blood splattered across the carpet, later matched through DNA testing. The crowbar, found in a garbage bin outside, carried the victim's fingerprints and Brittany's palm print. When the struggle ended, Audriana was bound with tape, her face bruised and eyes swollen. Tina's tone was cold and organized. "We'll take her out where nobody will find her," she said. Heather tried to back out. "I can't do this," she whispered, but Tina replied, "You're already in it." They carried Audriana to a car, still breathing but weak. Neighbors later testified that they heard a car door slam around 10:30 p.m. and a woman crying, but no one called police. Noise wasn't unusual in that neighborhood. The drive toward Jernigan Road was quiet except for the muffled sobs from the back seat. "Please," Audriana whispered, "just take me home. I won't tell anyone." Her voice was faint, each breath heavy with fear. Tina looked at her through the rearview mirror and said nothing. When the car stopped on the dirt road, surrounded by pine trees and darkness, the world narrowed down to headlights and fear. Tina opened the trunk and pulled Audriana out, dragging her through the dirt. Brittany stood beside the car, frozen. Heather stood a few feet away, crying. "Mama, don't," Brittany said again, but her mother raised a gas can and poured it over the girl's body. Audriana's voice broke into screams, pleading, promising, praying. The match hit the ground, and in an instant, flames roared through the woods. Heather's statement later read, "She screamed so loud I thought it would never stop." The fire was spotted by a passing driver who thought it was a brush fire. When firefighters arrived, they found a young woman burned beyond recognition, but still alive. She was rushed to Sacred Heart Hospital in Pensacola. Detective Ward described that night in court. "She could barely speak, but she wanted to tell us who did it." From her hospital bed, bandaged head to toe, Audriana whispered 3 names: Tina Brown, Heather Lee, and Brittany Miller. Her voice cracked, but her will didn't. She identified her attackers before slipping into unconsciousness. 16 days later, she died from her injuries. The autopsy report would later confirm severe thermal burns over 60% of her body, blunt force trauma to the skull, and electrical burns consistent with a stun gun. At the crime scene, investigators collected melted tape, charred fragments of clothing, and a small ring still on her finger. It was that ring her family used to identify her. Forensic analysis tied the gasoline residue on her body to a container found behind Tina's trailer. Detectives arrested Tina Brown first, then Heather Lee, and finally Brittany Miller. During questioning, Brittany broke down. "Mama told me to help," she said. "I didn't want to, but she said she'd handle it, and I had to listen." Her voice cracked through tears as she added, "I thought she was just trying to scare her." Heather's statement matched most of the details, though she insisted she never struck the victim. Tina, on the other hand, denied everything. "They're lying to save themselves," she told police.
"I didn't do anything to her.
Okay.
Promise to God.
And you were home all night.
I was at Heather's house."
Okay. You were at Heather's all night. Never left there. Because, see, the story between Heather and Darren is already shaky. And your story is a third version of what they've told us so far. Okay? Now, there's pieces and parts that are the same, but they aren't exactly the same. Okay? It concerns me. It sounds a little too good, and then the parts that are breaking up, I don't understand why they're not saying the same thing. Okay? And so we need to get to the bottom of this. And somebody's life may end over this.
Investigators pieced the story together over weeks, each detail painting a clearer picture of that night. The motive centered on jealousy and resentment, rumors about relationships, accusations of disrespect. Simple words turned into rage. When prosecutors presented the case months later, one of them said, "It's rare that we get a victim who names her killers. She gave us their names with her last breath." That statement became the foundation of the prosecution's case and the heart of the tragedy. She lived long enough to name them, and that's how justice began. But the real shock would come years later, inside a courtroom, on video. Detectives arrived at the burn site before sunrise on March 25, 2010. The air still carried the acrid smell of gasoline and wet ash. Trees near Jernigan Road were scorched black, and in the dirt lay melted tape, a small gas can, and fragments of burnt fabric. It was a gruesome scene, quiet except for the sound of officers documenting evidence. Lead investigator Sergeant Kevin Stevens later said, It looked like a war zone in one corner of the woods. Someone wanted her gone. Forensics began their work immediately, photographing every inch, collecting soil samples, and marking the trail of footprints leading back toward the road. Tire tracks matched a dark-colored Pontiac that neighbors had seen parked outside Tina Brown's trailer the night before. Hours later, detectives located that same car behind the home on Ashland Avenue. The back seat smelled of fuel and bleach, and there were faint reddish stains on the carpet. A lab test would later confirm it was Audriana Zimmerman's blood. Inside Tina Brown's trailer, investigators found chaos. The living room carpet was damp with cleaner, yet streaks of blood were still visible under a black light. A crowbar with brown residue leaned against a wall, and on the couch lay a roll of duct tape half used. Detective Lisa Ward testified, "You could smell the gasoline in that house. It clung to everything." Officers bagged clothing, rags, and the crowbar for analysis. On the kitchen counter sat a half-empty stun gun cartridge with residue consistent with electrical discharge. That same model matched the burn marks later found on the victim's skin. The story the physical evidence told was louder than any denial that would come later. Every corner of that trailer spoke of violence, and every attempt to clean it up only made it clearer. Neighbors began coming forward once news of the attack spread. One woman, Patricia Hines, told deputies she had heard horrible screaming around 10 p.m. that night. She said, "I thought it was just a fight. People argue around here all the time. I didn't know someone was dying." Another neighbor recalled seeing Brittany Miller outside the trailer right after, shaking and pacing. She was crying, saying, "Mama, what did you do?" He remembered. The witnesses didn't know then that those words would later echo in the courtroom. They described Brittany as terrified, barefoot, and trembling as her mother stood near the car, smoking a cigarette like nothing had happened. That detail alone helped investigators narrow the timeline to less than an hour between the assault and the fire. Detectives returned to question the three women separately. Heather Lee was the first to talk. After 6 hours of interrogation, she broke down. Tina hit her with the crowbar, she said through tears. Brittany held her down because she was scared of her mama. I didn't think she'd really do it. Her statement gave the case its first full picture. Hours later, when confronted with Heather's account, Tina Brown denied everything. "That girl's lying. She's trying to save herself," she told officers. Brittany, however, was caught in between. Too frightened to defy her mother, too guilty to stay silent. In her interview, she tried to distance herself from the worst parts. "Mama told me to grab her arms," she said. "I didn't hit her. I just did what I was told." The detective leaned forward and asked, "Brittany, why didn't you call for help?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper when she answered, "I thought she was already gone." As evidence poured in, a clear picture formed. The gas can from the burn site was traced back to a nearby convenience store, where surveillance footage showed Tina Brown purchasing fuel just hours before the attack. The clerk later testified, "She came in around 9:01 p.m., real quiet, paid cash, no conversation." The receipt timestamp matched the window investigators had already built. Phone records added another layer. A call placed from Brittany's phone to Heather's that night lasted only 13 seconds, but it pinged a tower less than a mile from Jernigan Road. That meant all three were together near the scene. Detectives now had physical, digital, and testimonial evidence pointing to the same conclusion. This was planned, executed, and covered up within hours. Forensic results left no room for doubt. The blood on the crowbar matched the victim's DNA. The partial fingerprint on the gas can belonged to Brittany Miller. In a later hearing, the prosecutor held that can up before the court and said, "This is not a story about a mistake. This is evidence of a choice." The words cut through the room. By then, even Brittany's attorney knew the damage was irreversible. When the interrogation tapes were played, the contrast between her statements and the evidence was glaring. On the tape, she insisted, "I didn't know Mama was going to do that." But investigators had already matched her shoe print from the trailer carpet to the dirt near the burn site. The investigation uncovered more about the relationship between mother and daughter than anyone expected. Teachers described Brittany as quiet, respectful, but always withdrawn, often skipping school to stay home with her mother. Tina, in contrast, had a reputation for control and temper. A former neighbor told reporters, Brittany never spoke unless Tina told her to. That control carried straight into the crime itself. One detective remarked in court, at 16, Brittany still called her mom Mama. But in that trailer, she stopped being a child. It was that realization that a mother's power had turned into something cruel that haunted investigators long after the case closed. Every lead brought the team closer to understanding the human side of the crime. The friendship between Audriana and Brittany had been real once, but jealousy and manipulation turned it into something deadly. The timeline proved that Tina orchestrated the plan. Heather followed out of fear, and Brittany obeyed out of dependence. The weight of that obedience became the backbone of the prosecution's argument later on. As the case file grew, detectives prepared the final report, 142 pages of photographs, transcripts, and forensic summaries. It ended with the line, "Victim identified suspects before death. Physical evidence corroborates her account in full." The investigation had given Audriana the last word. She named them, and science proved her right. What no one could have predicted was that years later, in a courtroom filled with reporters and silence, the same teenage girl who said she didn't know anything would watch her own confession played back on screen. And when the trial began, her biggest mistake wasn't what she did, it was what she said. On March 26, 2010, Escambia County deputies moved in quietly to make the first arrest. Tina Brown stepped out of her trailer wearing jeans, a t-shirt, and the same cold calm she'd shown the night of the murder. As deputies cuffed her hands behind her back, she looked at them and said, "You better have proof." One officer later testified, "She acted like we'd interrupted her morning routine. No emotion, just defiance." Her arrest set off a chain reaction that would bring every person involved into custody before the weekend was over. When news cameras captured her being led to the patrol car, she kept her chin up and refused to answer questions, only muttering, "They'll see the truth soon enough." Within 24 hours, detectives received a call that changed the course of the investigation. Heather Lee, the 17-year-old accomplice, had walked into the Escambia County Sheriff's Office on March 27, 2010, accompanied by a public defender. Her voice trembled as she told the front desk clerk, "I need to talk to someone about what happened." In the interrogation room, she confessed to being present during the attack, sobbing as she spoke. "I didn't stop her," Heather said, referring to Tina. "She told us to do it. I thought she'd just scare her, but then she lit the match." Investigators noted that Heather's statement aligned almost perfectly with the evidence they already had. When asked why she came forward, she said, "Because I can't sleep. I see her every night." Her cooperation secured her a plea deal later, but at that moment, it painted the final corner of the picture detectives had been building for days. The last to be brought in was the youngest, Brittany Miller, only 16 at the time. Detectives found her hiding at a friend's house in Pensacola on March 28, 2010. She cried as they placed her in the back of the patrol car, asking, "Am I going to jail?" When told she was under arrest for first-degree murder, she whispered, "I didn't mean to." In the interrogation room, she was small, scared, and caught between loyalty and truth. "Mama said I had to," she repeated again and again. Detectives asked her what she meant. "She told me if I didn't help, she'd do worse to me," Brittany said, voice cracking. The lead investigator, Sergeant Kevin Stevens, leaned forward and said softly, "Brittany, this is your chance to tell what really happened. You were there." She hesitated before whispering, "She told me to hold her down." The room went still. Forensic evidence had already tied Brittany to the scene, but now her own words confirmed what the investigators suspected. Obedience had crossed into complicity. During the hours-long interview, she contradicted herself several times, claiming at one point that she stayed in the car, then later admitting she saw her mother pour the gasoline. Each time, the detectives replayed small sections of her statement, letting the weight of her contradictions settle. One officer recalled, It wasn't the words that broke her. It was the silence after. When they asked why she didn't run or call police, Brittany said, "You don't go against Mama." That sentence would later become a haunting refrain throughout the trial. By early April, the state attorney's office had enough to proceed. Prosecutors gathered every piece of evidence, from the gas receipt time-stamped 9:06 p.m. on March 24th to the autopsy report confirming burns over 60% of Audriana's body. Still, what struck them most was Brittany's demeanor. They described her as calm, cooperative, and oddly detached. In one interview, Assistant State Attorney John Mulchin recalled, "It was hard to tell if she understood the gravity of what she'd done or if she was still under her mother's shadow." To ensure a fair process, investigators videotaped each interrogation. Those recordings, nearly 6 hours in total, would later become the most critical pieces of courtroom evidence. When the case reached court, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters filled the benches, family members clutched photos, and the public leaned in to see the girl at the center of the story. The prosecutor opened by playing Brittany's recorded interview. On the screen, her voice cracked as she said, "Mama told me to help." The jury watched as detectives showed her photos of the burn site, her reaction alternating between shock and denial. At one point, she whispered, "I can't look." But then the tape showed something that froze the courtroom. When asked by investigators how the fire started, Brittany smiled faintly and said, "Mama took care of it." That small smirk, caught on camera, changed everything. One juror later told reporters, "It wasn't what she said, it was the way she said it." When the footage ended, the courtroom stayed silent. Audriana's mother wept in the front row. Even the defense attorney looked shaken. The prosecutor turned to the jury and said, "You've just seen a 16-year-old girl trying to rewrite a crime that was never hers to control." He then held up a photo of the crowbar recovered from the scene, saying, "This is what obedience looks like when love turns into fear." From that moment, the emotional tide shifted. Sympathy began to fade, replaced by disbelief at how far a mother's influence had gone, and how deep it had pulled her daughter down. As the trial moved forward, the public couldn't look away. Every headline featured Brittany's face beside her mother's. 2 generations bound by blood and brutality. Even the investigators who'd worked dozens of murders said this one felt different. It wasn't the violence alone. It was who committed it. "We expect killers to look a certain way," one detective said in an interview years later. "But this was a mother and daughter. That's what stayed with us." The day the footage played marked a turning point in the trial. For the first time, Brittany's defiance slipped. As the jury watched her younger self justify every act, she sat in that same courtroom seat, hands clasped tightly, tears welling in her eyes. By the time the video ended, she wasn't hiding behind explanations anymore. She looked hollow, emptied out. The judge called for a short recess, and as the courtroom stood, Brittany didn't move. She just stared at the screen where her own words still lingered in the air. "Mama said I had to." The courtroom didn't gasp because of what they saw. They gasped because she looked proud. But the verdict wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new debate in America. The trial of Brittany Angelique Miller began in May 2013, 3 years after the night that changed everything in Ensley. The courtroom was full. Lawyers, reporters, neighbors, and a handful of jurors who would carry the weight of what they were about to hear. Prosecutors wasted no time setting the tone. Assistant State Attorney John Mulchin stood before the jury and said, "This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was planned, deliberate, and carried out with cruelty that defies explanation." He spoke slowly, letting each word settle over the room. He then held up a photo of 19-year-old Audriana Zimmerman, taken just weeks before her death, smiling in a church parking lot. "She trusted them," he said quietly, "and they turned that trust into torture." The state laid out its timeline hour by hour, minute by minute, showing the jurors' phone records, surveillance clips, and forensic photos. One investigator testified, "We found no hesitation. They lured her, trapped her, beat her, and burned her alive." Every detail felt unbearable. The jury saw the burned remains of the gasoline can, the crowbar marked with blood, and the duct tape fragments that still held strands of the victim's hair. When the autopsy findings were read aloud, thermal burns covering more than 60% of her body, skull fractures, and electrical burns from a stun gun, Audriana's mother sobbed, clutching her husband's arm. The prosecution's final exhibit was the video of Brittany's own confession. Her recorded voice filled the courtroom. "Mama told me to grab her arms." She said it like a memory, not an excuse. That line stayed echoing long after the tape stopped. When it was the defense's turn, their tone was completely different. Attorney Crystal Spencer, appointed to represent Brittany, began softly. "This is not the story of a cold-blooded killer. This is the story of a child raised in chaos, controlled by a mother who used fear as love." She walked the jury through Brittany's childhood, missed school, nights hiding from her mother's anger, and years of emotional manipulation. Teachers testified that Brittany often came to school with bruises and excuses. One former teacher said, "She was quiet, always tired. If you asked her a question, she'd look toward the door before answering, like she needed permission." The defense didn't deny her involvement. Instead, they argued that her actions came from years of conditioning, not cruelty. At 16, the attorney said, she didn't know what love was, only obedience. But the prosecution countered with facts. State Attorney Bill Edens reminded the jury that Brittany had multiple chances to stop, to run, or to call for help. "Fear doesn't explain lighting a match," he said firmly. He played the portion of her interrogation where she smiled when describing how her mother took care of it. His voice sharpened as he added, "That is not fear, that is choice." The courtroom sat in absolute silence. When the prosecutor pointed to Tina Brown sitting just a few feet away, he said, "The apple didn't fall far, but it still hit the ground." Each day of the trial peeled back another layer of emotion. Detectives, neighbors, and family members took the stand. One of the firefighters who found Audriana alive testified, "She was trying to talk. I leaned close and she whispered, 'They did this to me.'" He said his voice broke when he realized she was naming her killers with her last breaths. The jury watched as the hospital photos were displayed. Juror number 6 later said in an interview, "Those pictures will stay with me for life. You can't see that and forget it." By the 5th day, the mood had shifted from shock to sorrow. Even those who pitied Brittany couldn't look past the brutality of the evidence. On May 7, 2013, after several hours of deliberation, the judge called the courtroom to order. The room was still. Brittany stood between her attorneys, her face pale but unreadable. The judge read aloud, "For the charge of first-degree murder, the court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." A gasp broke from the back row. Brittany blinked, but didn't cry. For a brief second, she looked at her mother, who sat handcuffed in her own orange jumpsuit. Tina looked back without emotion. The illusion that she might somehow go home ended right there. One deputy later said, "You could see it hit her, but she kept her head up, like she finally understood it was over." The community of Ensley was divided. Some believed justice had been served. Others saw a teenager destroyed by the woman who raised her. Local papers ran headlines calling it "the fire that tore a town apart." At Audriana's memorial, her pastor told the congregation, "Forgiveness doesn't erase accountability. Justice must speak even when mercy cannot." For Brittany's side, family friends argued she was as much a victim as the one she helped kill. One relative said outside the courthouse, "If she had been born to someone else, maybe none of this would have happened." But sympathy didn't change the law. The sentence stood. Years later, in 2017, Brittany's attorneys filed a motion to withdraw her plea, citing the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Miller v. Alabama, 2012, which prohibited mandatory life sentences for juveniles. They argued she hadn't fully understood her rights when she accepted the plea. During the resentencing hearing in October 2017, her lawyer stated, "She was 16, following her mother's lead. The law recognizes that children are different." Brittany spoke briefly for the first time, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry for what happened. I was scared. I wish I could take it back." The courtroom listened, but the prosecution stood firm. Assistant State Attorney Molchan said, "Fear may explain what she felt, but it doesn't excuse what she did." On November 6, 2017, the judge denied her motion and reaffirmed her life sentence. The written order stated, while the defendant's youth was considered, the nature of the crime warrants the original punishment. 2 years later, on April 3, 2019, Florida's First District Court of Appeal upheld that decision, writing that the trial court had carefully weighed both the brutality of the offense and the mitigating factors of age. The appeals ended there. Brittany remained at Lowell Correctional Institution, her future decided before her 18th birthday. By the end of the decade, the story of Audriana Zimmerman and Brittany Miller had become part of Florida's ongoing debate about juvenile justice. Some saw the sentence as necessary, others as a tragedy within a tragedy. But in every courtroom, in every retelling, one line from the prosecution still echoed: "Justice may have spoken, but mercy never found a voice." And yet, the question still lingers. What do we do with children who kill? Years passed, but the case that began in a quiet corner of Ensley never truly ended. Tina LaSonia Brown, the woman once called the ringleader, the one who ordered, struck, and ignited, sat through the slow decay of appeals and resentencing. In 2012, she was sentenced to death, and by early 2013, she had joined the handful of women on Florida's death row, one of only 5 awaiting execution at that time. The verdict was called "Justice for a Crime Too Cruel to Comprehend." But when Florida's death penalty law was overturned in 2016, requiring unanimous jury recommendations, her sentence was automatically reviewed. The new ruling replaced her death sentence with life without parole, and just like that, the woman who once believed she'd die by lethal injection instead began her forever inside Lowell Correctional Institution. One guard who processed her intake later said, "She never flinched, just looked me in the eye and said, 'I did what I had to do.'" Even behind bars, she carried the same defiance that had fueled the night of March 24, 2010. Heather Trinny Lee, the third accomplice, accepted her punishment years earlier. In 2011, she stood before a judge and pled guilty to second-degree murder and kidnapping. "I didn't stop her," she said through tears. "I was scared, but I could have stopped her." That statement, simple, broken, and honest, earned her a reduced sentence of 40 years in prison. She testified against Tina and Brittany, detailing the timeline of the attack, the drive to Jernigan Road, and the horrifying final moments of Audriana Zimmerman's life. She now serves her sentence at a women's correctional facility in Ocala, Florida, where prison reports describe her as compliant and quiet. Her projected release date is 2051, by which time she will be in her late 50s. Brittany Angelique Miller, the youngest of them all, has now spent nearly half her life behind bars. 16 years old when she held Audriana down at her mother's command. She is now 32, still serving her life without parole sentence at Lowell Correctional Institution. Prison staff describe her as soft-spoken, polite, and often withdrawn. She spends her days working in the library and reading law books, hoping to one day qualify for reconsideration under evolving juvenile sentencing laws. During her 2017 resentencing hearing, she spoke in a trembling voice. "I wish I had been strong enough to stop her. I wish I could take it back." But her plea for mercy went unanswered. The court reaffirmed her life sentence, and in April 2019, the First District Court of Appeal upheld that decision, writing, "The nature of the crime outweighs the mitigating factors of youth." Back in Ensley, the years have softened the land, but not the memory. The trailer park on Ashland Avenue still stands, but the Brown family's trailer is long gone. New families live there now, unaware that the patch of dirt near the back fence was once a crime scene marked by police tape and silence. The locals rarely talk about it, but some say you can still feel something heavy in the air when you drive down Jernigan Road on a cool night. The trees that once caught fire that March still grow there, black scars faintly visible beneath the bark. It's a road many refuse to take after dark. At Holy Cross Cemetery in Pensacola, a simple headstone bears the name Adriana Redon Zimmerman. The inscription reads, "Loved, heard, and never forgotten." Every April, her mother, Linda Zimmerman, still visits with a handful of roses and a candle. She told P&J in a 2019 interview, "I forgave them because I had to, not because I forgot. My daughter lived 16 days in pain, but she used that time to tell us the truth. That's what keeps me going." Local law enforcement officers and the original detectives still visit her grave each year on March 24th, the date of the attack. For them, she's more than a case number. She's the voice that helped close it. In Ensley, Adriana's story has been woven into the community's conscience. A program called Adriana's Promise was established in 2015 to help teens in abusive or controlling households. Its slogan reads, "She lived long enough to speak. We listen so others don't have to burn." Counselors use her case to teach young people about manipulation, fear, and the price of silence. Even now, 15 years later, her story continues to be studied in law classes and juvenile reform discussions. A retired prosecutor who once worked the case said in 2023, "It's not just a murder case. It's a mirror. It shows how power, fear, and love can destroy each other when there's no one to stop them." Inside Lowell, Brittany still walks past the chapel every morning on her way to her prison job. Officers say she sometimes stops there alone, staring at the stained glass window for several minutes before moving on. She doesn't speak of her mother anymore, but she once told a counselor, "I dream about fire. When I wake up, I smell it." Those words were recorded in a psychological report submitted to the Florida Department of Corrections in 2021. To this day, she remains isolated from Tina Brown, housed in a separate wing, forbidden from contact. The two women who once shared a home now live less than 500 yards apart, but they might as well be in different worlds. As of today, 15 years after the murder, the story still lingers across Florida courtrooms and classrooms alike. Detectives who worked the case say it changed how they approach juvenile offenders forever. One of them, Detective Lisa Ward, reflected, "You don't forget a child who became part of something so awful because she didn't know how to say no. That's the part that haunts you." And for many in Escambia County, the haunting never stopped. The flames that burned that night left marks that time refuses to erase. At the cemetery, Adriana's mother leaves a single note each year beside her daughter's headstone. This year's note simply said, "You told the truth, baby. That's what saved us." That truth, spoken through pain, whispered through fire, is why this story still echoes 15 years later. In that courtroom, a teenager lied, sure she'd walk free. But the truth, caught on camera, had other plans. And maybe that's the hardest lesson this case leaves behind. That innocence isn't always about age, and guilt doesn't always look like evil. If this story moved you, share her name, because memory is its own kind of justice.